Title: The Russian Sleep Experiment. Chapter 1. The Proposal. Anatoly Orlov stood in the dimly lit room, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out the narrow window. The dark clouds gathered over the sprawling Soviet facility, casting long, jagged shadows on the cold concrete floor. The building itself seemed to echo with a low hum, as though it too were alive, breathing in sync with the very heartbeat of the government that had commissioned this terrible experiment. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass, but Orlov remained unmoved, his mind focused on the task at hand. The door behind him creaked open, and a voice, cold, emotionless, spoke from the threshold. "Dr. Orlov," the voice said, "it is time." Turning slowly, Orlov faced his superior, General Ivanov, a man whose very presence exuded authority and fear. Ivanov was a man who demanded results, who took little interest in the suffering of others, as long as the mission was accomplished. Orlov had known him for years, but today there was something different in the air. There was a weight that hung between them, an unspoken understanding that what was to come could not be undone. "Are the prisoners ready?" Orlov asked, his voice steady, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Ivanov's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "They are, but do not concern yourself with them. Focus on your work. The results are what matter." Orlov nodded. "Of course, General." But as Ivanov turned to leave, Orlov couldn't shake the gnawing feeling at the back of his mind. He had spent months designing this experiment, refining the process, and securing the resources. But no amount of preparation could rid him of the sense that they were treading on dangerous ground. No matter how he tried to silence it, that voice in the back of his head, the one that spoke of consequences, of a line that should never be crossed, refused to be ignored. But it was too late now. The experiment had already begun. The Russian sleep experiment was a project unlike any other in Soviet history. It wasn't about military strategy, or intelligence gathering, or any of the other typical government objectives. This experiment was about the mind, the breaking of it, the twisting of it. The goal was simple: to create soldiers who never slept, who could endure the most grueling conditions without ever needing rest. To forge a new breed of soldier who could remain awake for days, weeks, even months, without the crippling weakness of fatigue. The prisoners were carefully chosen, political dissidents who had been convicted of espionage, sabotage, or worse. These were men and women who had been deemed expendable by the regime, their lives seen as little more than pawns in a game much larger than themselves. They were locked away in isolation, stripped of everything, and when they were brought to the experiment, they were told only one thing: survive, and you will be free. But the freedom they were promised was never meant to come. The prisoners. In the cold, sterile chamber, the 5 prisoners sat in a line, each one strapped to a metal chair, their bodies stiff with fear and confusion. The chamber was small, the walls lined with monitoring equipment and a thick, foul-smelling gas that filled the air, creating a haze that seemed to cloud their senses. The prisoners' eyes darted around nervously, but they were not allowed to speak to one another, to break the silence. They knew what would happen if they did. The room was locked tight, the only way in or out being the heavy door at the far end, which remained sealed. It was designed to be airtight, keeping out any trace of light or sound from the outside world. There was no escape. Orlov stood behind a thick glass window that separated him from the prisoners, his hands clasped in front of him, as he watched them, studying their reactions. He could feel the weight of their fear. It was palpable, thick in the air. He could almost taste it. But he pushed that feeling aside, replacing it with a cold, clinical detachment. This was science. It was necessary. The Soviet Union needed soldiers who could fight without sleep, who could endure without weakness. And these prisoners, these subjects, were the means to that end. "Activate the gas," Orlov ordered, his voice calm, controlled. A technician beside him complied, flipping the switch that released the gas into the chamber. The prisoners gasped, their eyes widening in alarm as the air became heavy and thick with the mist. The gas would keep them awake for days, perhaps even weeks. It was a stimulant, designed to push the human body to its absolute limits. The prisoners struggled against their restraints, their breathing growing erratic as the gas began to take hold. They were awake. They were alive, but they were already beginning to feel the pressure. Their bodies were reacting violently as the chemical fog worked its way through their systems, forcing their hearts to race, their minds to hyper-focus. For the first few hours, the prisoners held on. They remained silent, their bodies trembling but still functional. The gas had not yet begun to break them, but soon the whispers began. The first prisoner, a tall man with dark, haunted eyes, began to speak, his voice a low, strained murmur. "What is this? What is happening?" His words echoed through the chamber, but no one responded. There was no need to answer. The experiment had begun. For Santa the first day. By the time the first full day passed, the prisoners' physical reactions were becoming obvious. Their skin had turned pale, their eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Their faces were drawn, their bodies stiff, but they refused to speak. They couldn't. They had been told they must remain silent, for fear of the consequences if they didn't. Orlov watched them through the glass, making meticulous notes on their reactions. He could see the faint tremors in their hands, the way their heads swiveled at every sound, every flicker of light. They were becoming more aware of the space around them, more attuned to the sensory overload. But still, they held on. He had expected this. The first day was always the easiest. The body was strong at first. It resisted. But as the days stretched on, and the lack of sleep began to take its toll, the cracks would begin to show. And it was the cracks that interested him. It was in those moments of fragility where he would find the true answers. Day 2. On the second day, the first signs of distress became apparent. One prisoner, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, began to mutter under his breath. He had started to hallucinate, convinced that he could hear voices outside the chamber. At first, it was faint, a low murmur that could have been nothing more than the sound of the gas moving through the chamber. But as the hours wore on, the voices grew clearer, more distinct. "Help me. Please. Let me out," he whispered, his voice trembling. His hands were shaking as he reached for the glass window, his eyes wide and desperate. But the voices weren't real. Orlov knew this. It was a symptom of the gas. They all would experience it. The mind could only take so much, and soon it would begin to betray them. By the evening, the prisoner's mind had snapped. He started screaming, his voice growing raw, desperate. The other prisoners watched him, their expressions empty. They had seen the madness beginning to creep into his mind, and they knew they were next. Orlov observed the scene from his control room, but he didn't move. He had seen this before. The prisoners had been chosen because they were expendable. They were the perfect subjects for this experiment. They had no one to save them. No one would ever know what happened to them. Of the moment of truth. The first death came on the morning of the third day. It was subtle at first, just a twitching of the hand, a slight slump of the shoulders. But then, when Orlov checked the monitors, he realized the man had stopped breathing. He was dead. The gas, it seemed, had finally done its work. The room was silent. Orlov's eyes flickered with something. Regret, perhaps, or just recognition of the inevitable. He knew there would be more deaths, more suffering. But what fascinated him was the fact that the surviving prisoners hadn't reacted the way he thought they would. They didn't scream or cry. They didn't beg for mercy. They simply stared, their eyes wide and vacant, as if they had already seen death, as if they had already been consumed by it. Orlov's pen scratched against the paper, his notes becoming more and more detailed. He was capturing something extraordinary, the breaking point of the human mind. But it wasn't just the mind that was breaking. Chapter Summary. In Chapter 1, Dr. Orlov begins the Russian sleep experiment, observing the psychological and physical effects of extreme sleep deprivation on 5 political prisoners. The chapter introduces the setting, an isolated Soviet facility, and the prisoners' initial reactions to the gas designed to keep them awake. As the gas takes effect, the prisoners' mental states begin to unravel. The first signs of madness emerge, setting the stage for the horrors to come. Orlov remains detached, focused on the data, but the subtle hints of fear and uncertainty begin to creep into the story as the experiment escalates. The tension grows as the experiment moves into uncharted, disturbing territory. Chapter 2. The beginning of the end. The first hours after the gas was administered passed quietly, with only the soft rustling of the prisoners' movements breaking the otherwise still air. Dr. Orloff watched from the control room, his eyes cold and calculating as he observed through the small glass window. The chamber was sealed, the prisoners inside and the gas now flooding the room, keeping them awake for the duration of the experiment. Their initial reactions were subtle: subdued fidgeting, a few deep breaths, the occasional cough. It wasn't unusual, they were still adjusting. But Orloff had seen the data from previous tests. He knew the gas would soon begin to affect them in ways that would make the experiment both fascinating and terrifying. The room was small, about 20 feet by 10 feet, with grey cracked walls that seemed to close in on the prisoners as they sat strapped to their chairs. There was a single dim light hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. The smell of the gas lingered in the air, thick and acrid, and Orloff noted the slight twitch in the prisoners' expressions as they inhaled it. The prisoners sat in absolute silence, each of them bound to a steel chair, their faces tight with nervous energy, their hands clenched into fists. They had been told they would be allowed to sleep once the 30 days were over, but Orloff had never intended for that promise to be fulfilled. Not for them, not for anyone. After all, the purpose of this experiment was not just to observe the effects of sleep deprivation. It was to break them, to see what happened when the human mind was pushed past its limits, when the body was deprived of its most basic need for rest. Orloff had studied the reports. He knew that after the first few days, the psychological effects would become unbearable. The mind would begin to fracture, losing its grip on reality, but he had to see it for himself. He had to witness the horror. As the hours passed, Orloff's excitement began to shift into something darker, something he couldn't quite name. There was an unspoken agreement among the team in the control room that the true terror of the experiment had yet to begin. They had crossed the line. They were no longer watching simple human subjects. They were witnessing the collapse of the human mind itself. By the third hour, the first signs of distress appeared. The man sitting closest to the observation window, prisoner number 1, a tall man with dark eyes and a rough, angular face, shifted in his chair. His breath quickened, and his eyes darted nervously to the corners of the room, as if expecting someone, or something, was lurking there. He gasped, then let out a shaky laugh, as if embarrassed by his own reaction. "Is this some kind of joke?" he muttered under his breath. "You expect me to stay awake forever? Forever?" His words were barely audible, but Orloff caught them. The sound of his voice carried a trace of fear, of disbelief. The prisoners were still in the early stages, still naive enough to believe that their endurance would be enough to survive the experiment. But Orloff knew better. They would break. The gas was a tool, but the real horror would come from within their own minds. As the first hours slipped into the second, the room grew more tense. Prisoner number 2, a short man with wiry hair, began to shift restlessly in his chair. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, but he still held himself together. His gaze kept drifting toward the wall, as though there was something there just beyond his line of sight. He started mumbling to himself, his voice low and strained, but when he realized he was speaking aloud, he quickly fell silent. Orloff noticed the change. The prisoners were not speaking to each other, but their paranoia was beginning to set in. The isolation, the fear of the unknown, and the absence of sleep were already wearing on them. The first break. The first true sign that the experiment was taking hold came around 6 hours in. The silence in the room became unbearable. The prisoners could no longer hold their focus. They began to move their bodies, twitching in their seats, shaking uncontrollably as the effects of the gas started to twist their minds. The skin on their faces grew pale, their eyes wide with panic. Prisoner number 1, still the most vocal of the group, began to speak again. His words were slow and uneven, as if he were forcing them out against his will. "What's happening to us?" His voice quivered. "I can't see straight. The walls, they're moving. Are they moving?" A flicker of movement caught his eye, and suddenly he began to thrash against his restraints, a manic energy taking over his body. He screamed for help, but there was no one to answer him. The door was locked, the window sealed, and the gas continued to fill the room, pushing them further into madness. Orlov leaned closer to the control panel, his hand hovering over the button that would record their reactions. He noted the rapid breathing, the twitching of muscles, the first signs of paranoia, of sensory disorientation. He could already see the disintegration of their minds beginning. Beat them day one, the shadows. The first full day in the chamber was marked by a visible breakdown in the prisoners' mental states. By the time the sun had risen outside, casting faint light through the small observation window, the prisoners had begun to hallucinate. Prisoner number 1 was still the loudest, his voice now a constant mutter. His mind was already unraveling. "The shadows are coming for me," he whispered. "I see them in the corners. They're always watching." Orlov watched intently through the glass, noting how prisoner number 1's body trembled as if he could feel invisible eyes on him. The man's pupils were dilated, his face pale, slick with sweat. His mind was beginning to twist. He had started to see things that weren't there. This was what Orlov had anticipated, but it was still unsettling. The other prisoners were beginning to show the same signs. Prisoner number 2, who had been the most stoic, now seemed to stare blankly at the ceiling, muttering softly. "Stop it," he said, his voice distant. "Please, make it stop. I can't hear them anymore." The voices, the whispers in their minds, were becoming more prominent. It was the first true indication that the experiment was affecting their psyche. They were slipping into madness. The gas had succeeded in keeping them awake, but now it was triggering their deepest fears, their worst impulses. It was all starting to unravel. Prisoner number 3, a tall, lean man who had said little since the beginning of the experiment, suddenly stood up in his chair, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. "There's something in here with us," he hissed, his voice wild with terror. "Something else. Something alive." He turned and slammed his fists against the glass window, his breath ragged and panicked. "Let me out! Please! Please! You have to let me out!" The glass rattled with each blow, but the door remained sealed. The technicians outside the chamber could only watch, unable to intervene. Orlov was fascinated by the sight before him. The prisoners were spiraling into madness, and yet the data was invaluable. "Day 1, Orlov muttered, his voice cold and detached. "This is only the beginning." Day 2, descent into chaos. By the second day, the situation had deteriorated. The prisoners had grown quieter, withdrawn. The initial signs of paranoia had given way to full-blown hysteria in some. Prisoner number 1, who had been the most vocal, was now lying in his chair, muttering under his breath. His eyes darted around, tracking invisible movements. His body was trembling uncontrollably. Prisoner number 2, whose once calm demeanor had vanished, had begun scratching at his arms, his fingernails digging deep into his skin as though trying to tear something out. His eyes were glazed, his movements erratic, and he no longer spoke. Instead, he stared at the walls, his body rocking back and forth like a child who had lost all sense of time. Prisoner number 3, the one who had seen the shadows, was now laughing hysterically. His voice echoed off the walls, but his laughter wasn't one of joy. It was manic, desperate. The other prisoners ignored him, locked in their own spiraling thoughts, their own twisted perceptions of reality. Orlov watched this unfold with detached fascination, taking meticulous notes. The gas was working exactly as it had been designed to. The prisoners were no longer capable of thinking clearly, and their physical health was deteriorating. They were breaking, and Orlov knew that the true horror was still to come. He felt a sense of satisfaction as he watched them, even though a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind told him that something wasn't right. He ignored it, focusing instead on the data, on the results. This was what he had been working for, but the voice wouldn't leave him. And as he turned his attention back to the prisoners, the air in the control room grew heavier. The whispers had started again, faint at first, but unmistakable. They seemed to come from everywhere, filling the silence between his thoughts. It was only the beginning, but already he wondered if he would be able to stop it before it was too late. Chapter summary. In Chapter 2, the prisoners begin to show the first signs of the psychological toll that the sleep deprivation is taking on them. Orlov, detached and focused, continues his observation as the prisoners' sanity begins to fracture. Their paranoia, hallucinations, and strange behaviors signal that the gas is working as intended, but the atmosphere in the chamber grows increasingly tense and disturbing. As the prisoners spiral deeper into madness, Orlov is forced to confront the horrific reality of what he has unleashed. Though he is still driven by a clinical obsession with the data, the tension builds as the horror of the experiment unfolds. Chapter 3. The Shadows Within. By the third day, the whispers in the chamber had grown louder, reverberating like an echo of insanity, bouncing off the cold, lifeless walls of the sealed room. Dr. Orlov sat in the control room, his fingers trembling as he scribbled down notes, his eyes never leaving the monitors. The experiment was proceeding precisely as he had planned, yet a creeping feeling began to claw at the back of his mind. It was the first sensation of doubt, and it unsettled him. The prisoners were beginning to crack, their bodies contorting in ways that were not merely physical, but mental. The gas had done its job. The hours without sleep were taking their toll. But it wasn't just the obvious signs, the twitches, the shallow breaths, the erratic movements. It was something darker, something deeper. Prisoner number 1 was now twitching in his chair, his fingers curling and uncurling involuntarily, as though caught in a silent, invisible dance. His lips trembled, mouthing words that Orlov couldn't quite understand, his voice a low, guttural murmur that seemed to echo in the sterile air. "Stop it! Stop it!" Prisoner number 1 repeated over and over, his voice breaking as if the very sound of it hurt him. Prisoner number 2 was no better. His arms were covered in deep scratches, blood oozing from where his nails had dug into his own skin. The blood didn't seem to faze him. His face, though pale, held a strange serenity, an eerie calmness that didn't belong. But his eyes were wide and unblinking, staring at nothing, at something far beyond Orlov's reach. They were empty, devoid of life. It was as if the man was no longer aware of his surroundings, trapped in some unseen world. Orlov felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. He had known that sleep deprivation would push them to their limits, but the transformation before him felt unnatural. They were no longer just prisoners. They were becoming something other, something unrecognizable. Prisoner number 3, who had been the first to speak of the shadows, had stopped speaking altogether. Instead, he rocked back and forth in his chair, eyes fixed on the corner of the room. His breath was shallow, his body shaking violently, as though trying to escape something only he could see. The more Orlov watched him, the more he felt an unsettling sensation. The feeling that the man was not alone in the room, that something was there with him, something invisible. The scratching noises, the ones Orlov had first dismissed as mere physical symptoms, had begun again, but now they were louder, more insistent. It was no longer just the sound of fingernails dragging across the surface of the metal chairs. It had turned into something else, something alive. It sounded like something scraping at the walls, an almost organic, pulsing sound, like claws on flesh. Orlov's pen paused mid-sentence as the sound reached its peak. He turned sharply to his team, who were monitoring the chambers from their consoles. No one spoke, but their faces mirrored the growing unease Orlov was starting to feel. "Check the gas levels," Orlov ordered, his voice tight. It must be affecting them more than expected. The technician, who had been silent, nodded and began adjusting the dials on the gas control panel. The gas should have been harmless in the quantities they were using. It had been tested, adjusted, and recalibrated countless times before this experiment. It was safe. But what was happening inside the chamber, what was happening to the prisoners, didn't feel safe. "Gas levels are normal, Doctor," the technician replied, his voice shaking slightly. Orlov didn't respond immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the chamber. Prisoner number 2 had started muttering again, but now his words were unintelligible, like a string of disjointed syllables, unrecognizable and alien. The room fell into an oppressive silence, broken only by the low hum of machinery and the occasional rasping breath from the prisoners. But then, something shifted. A sharp cry pierced the air. Prisoner number 3, still rocking back and forth, suddenly froze. His body jerked upright, his head snapping toward the corner of the room, his eyes wide and unblinking. The shriek that escaped his throat was guttural, animalistic. It reverberated through the chamber, bouncing off the walls and shaking the foundation. The sound was like nothing Orlov had ever heard, an expression of pure terror that seemed to come from the deepest part of the human soul. And then, silence. The stillness that followed was deafening. The prisoners were no longer moving. They were frozen, staring at something that Orlov could not see, something beyond the glass, something invisible to the human eye but palpable in the tension of the room. Orlov's mind raced. He had studied the effects of sleep deprivation on the brain, delirium, hallucinations, paranoia. But this was beyond anything he had anticipated. The prisoners were no longer reacting in ways he could predict. The behavior was not just erratic, it was unnatural. The shadows they had begun to see, the things they whispered about in the darkness, were becoming something more tangible. They were becoming real. Suddenly, prisoner number 1 let out another scream. His voice, strained and desperate, broke through the silence like a crack in glass. "They're coming! They're coming!" His eyes were wide with panic, his hands reaching toward the glass. They're inside! They're inside me!" Orlov felt a cold sweat bead at the back of his neck. Something wasn't right. The experiment was slipping from his control. Subs, the descent. The next hours passed in a blur of frantic scribbling and growing tension. Orlov's mind couldn't focus. His pen scratched furiously across the paper, but the words felt meaningless. He had to do something. He had to stop this. But as the hours dragged on, he realized that the point of no return had long since passed. The prisoners were no longer responding to commands, or even to basic stimuli. They were beyond that. The gas was still active, still keeping them awake. But the longer they stayed conscious, the more they seemed to lose their grip on reality. Prisoner number 2 had stopped moving entirely, his body limp and lifeless, though his eyes remained wide open, locked in a permanent stare. Prisoner number 1 was now shaking uncontrollably, his body spasming as if tortured by some invisible force. He was mumbling, his voice rising and falling erratically. "Stop looking at me! Stop looking at me!" But there was no one there. Orlov's eyes flickered to the monitoring equipment, his hand hovering over the emergency shutdown button. He should end it. He should stop the experiment before it went any further. But something in him refused. Something deep inside, a sense of professional obsession perhaps, kept him from pulling the trigger. He had come this far. He had to see it through. "Doctor, they're not responding to the gas anymore," the technician said, his voice trembling. Orlov turned to him, his expression cold, though a flicker of concern ignited in his chest. "What do you mean?" Orlov asked, though he could guess the answer. They're not reacting like before," the technician repeated. "They're not following the usual signs of sleep deprivation. It's almost like they're aware of the gas. It's as though they've adapted to it." Orlov's mind raced. The gas wasn't supposed to lose its effectiveness. He had formulated the perfect compound, designed to force the brain to stay active, alert. This wasn't possible. And yet, the prisoners had begun to make strange, low noises again. This time, it wasn't just muttering or screaming. It was something worse, something guttural, something primal. Orlov's stomach tightened as he watched them. Prisoner number 1's body was now stiff, his mouth open in a silent scream. But his eyes, they were locked on Orlov's. For a moment, everything stopped. Orlov's breath caught in his throat. It was like the prisoner was watching him. But how? How could he see through the glass, through the wall? Prisoner number 1 blinked slowly, and in that moment, it was clear. He wasn't seeing Orlov. He was seeing something else. And then it happened. Prisoner number 1's hands shot up to his face, tearing at his own flesh with such ferocity that Orlov froze in horror. The man screamed again, louder this time, but it was a scream of agony, of madness, not of pain. It was as if he had lost his mind entirely. The others followed suit, scratching at their own faces, their bodies, tearing off their skin in jagged, desperate motions. Blood poured from the gashes, staining the chairs, the walls, and the floor. The room was filled with the unmistakable smell of iron, of raw meat. Chapter 4. The Hollow Eyes. It was the silence that first unsettled Dr. Orloff. The hum of the gas, once a constant background noise, had become strangely absent. The lab, the observation room, the chamber, everything felt still. Too still. The prisoners had stopped their incessant movements. The soft mutterings, the paranoid glances, the cries of terror, they had all ceased. There was only the sound of Orloff's own breathing, sharp in the thick air of the control room. A flicker of unease settled in his chest. For a brief moment, Orloff found himself questioning the direction the experiment had taken. Was it too much? He had planned for this, the breakdowns, the hallucinations, the violent outbursts. But there was something different now, a gnawing emptiness. The prisoners hadn't just begun to unravel, they had disappeared into something else. The monitors displayed images of the chamber where the 5 prisoners had been kept. 4 of them were visible, still, lifeless, their bodies slumped forward in their chairs, their heads hanging at unnatural angles. Prisoner number 1, who had once screamed the loudest, was now eerily quiet, his body unrecognizable, contorted in a twisted mockery of human form. Orloff's stomach twisted as he stared at the screen. The gas had done its job. They were awake. But in their wake, something worse had emerged. The prisoners weren't just exhausted. They were changed. They had become something other than human, something hollow, something empty. Their eyes, those once vibrant windows to the soul, had turned dark, lifeless, as though the very essence of who they had been drained from them. Prisoner 1. The first break. The man who had once screamed the loudest, prisoner number 1, sat motionless in his chair, his arms dangling limply by his sides. His face was pale, drained of color, as though the blood had been sucked from his body. His eyes, those once piercing, angry eyes, were now black voids, empty and devoid of any recognition. Orloff leaned closer to the monitor, his breath catching in his throat. What had happened to him? Prisoner number 1's mouth twitched, a slight grimace curling his lips as if trying to speak, but no sound came. Orloff's eyes narrowed. It was as if the man was trying to force something out, but the words wouldn't form. Then, with an unnatural jerk, the prisoner's head shot up, his neck twisting with a sickening crack that made Orloff wince. The prisoner's eyes snapped to the observation window, locking onto Orloff's with an intensity that made his heart stutter. "You opened the door," prisoner number 1 whispered, his voice barely audible like a wind-blown murmur. "Now you can never close it." The words sank into Orloff's mind like ice. His breath quickened. There was something unnatural in the way the prisoner's voice had reverberated through the chamber, a coldness to it that seemed to linger in the air. "What are you saying?" Orloff muttered to himself, as if trying to make sense of it. But the man's gaze never wavered. Those hollow eyes, filled with something beyond fear, beyond human comprehension, stared into Orloff's very soul. Before Orloff could answer, the man's mouth opened wider, unnaturally wide, as if something had stretched it beyond its natural limit. A low, bone-chilling growl emerged from deep within his throat, followed by a chorus of whispers. They seemed to come from the prisoner's very being, vibrating in the air around him like the echo of some long-forgotten nightmare. "They're coming. For you. For all of us." The prisoner's voice morphed into something unrecognizable, as if possessed by a force far beyond human understanding. His body trembled, spasming violently as if being gripped by some unseen force. Orloff recoiled, his skin crawling with dread. No, he thought, desperately clinging to his professional detachment. This was just a result of the experiment. The mind was breaking down. But deep down, Orloff knew it wasn't. Something had shifted. The experiment had crossed a line. Max, of the darkness that follows. The whispers grew louder. Orloff's gaze darted to the other prisoners, who were also beginning to stir. Prisoner number 2, once a stoic figure, was now trembling uncontrollably. His eyes were wide open, but they were no longer focused. His body jerked, his arms flailing at his restraints as if trying to escape an invisible force. His lips moved frantically, forming words that seemed to melt together, incoherent. It's in the walls. It's inside. They're watching us. Orloff's pulse quickened. His hands shook as he took notes, writing down the prisoner's mutterings. This wasn't supposed to happen. Prisoner number 3 had stopped moving altogether. His body was rigid, frozen in place like a statue. His eyes, once wide with terror, now stared ahead blankly, but the darkness behind them, Orloff could feel it. Something was behind those eyes. Something unnatural. Prisoner number 3's mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence in the chamber grew thicker, as though the very air was pressing in on him, holding him in place. Orloff watched with growing unease as prisoner number 4, who had remained mostly silent throughout the experiment, began to exhibit erratic behavior. His hands twitched at his sides, his legs shaking violently. A low growl rumbled deep within his throat as if his body were a mere shell, inhabited by something else. His lips parted, and a voice, not his own, echoed out. A voice deep and guttural, like the sound of something clawing its way out of the earth. You should have let us sleep. Now it's too late. We are awake, and they are inside. Orloff stepped back from the observation window, his mind racing. The prisoners weren't just hallucinating. They were speaking of things they couldn't possibly understand, of things inside them, inside their minds, their very beings. They were becoming something else, something alien. Before he could stop himself, Orloff turned to the technician at the control panel. His voice was ragged, frantic, though he tried to hide it. Shut it off, now! But it was too late. The tearing. The shadows in the room deepened, swirling around the prisoners, as if they were alive. Orloff could see them, faint at first, but slowly becoming more pronounced. Long, sinewy forms, like tendrils of darkness, creeping through the cracks in the walls. The room itself seemed to pulse. A heartbeat, a rhythm that resonated with a deep, primal force. Prisoner number 1, whose body had once been limp and broken, was now moving. Slowly, almost mechanically, he stood up, his limbs jerking at strange angles. He made no sound, but his body twitched violently with every step. His face was a mask of blood and sweat, his skin raw and torn from where he had scratched at it. But his eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, never left Orloff. You've let them in, the prisoner whispered, his voice barely a rasp. Now they are part of us. Orloff's heart hammered in his chest as he tried to step back, but his legs felt like stone. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the prisoner, whose features seemed to be distorting, elongating, as though his very face was being stretched out of shape. Then, with a sickening crack, the prisoner's neck twisted, his head rotating a full 180 degrees, until his eyes were fixed on Orloff once more. But this time, there was no recognition, only the hollow emptiness of something else. Orloff stumbled back from the window, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, trying to steady himself, but the scene inside the chamber was too much. The prisoners were no longer prisoners. They had changed. Prisoner number 2, whose body had been twitching earlier, suddenly lunged forward, his arms reaching toward the glass, his mouth opening wide to scream. But the sound was wrong. It wasn't a scream. It was something else. A terrible, inhuman shriek that vibrated through Orloff's very bones. He turned away from the window, his mind spinning. What had he done? The darkness had taken them. It had taken them all. The shadows in the walls. As Orloff staggered back from the observation window, the world around him seemed to blur. The air felt heavy, thick with dread, as though the very walls of the building had become sentient, alive with hunger. He could feel it, feel the pressure building in the room, like something was pressing in from all sides. And then, the walls moved. At first it was subtle, just a soft crackling sound, like the creaking of an old house settling into its foundation. But then the walls began to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The cracks in the stone expanded, as though the room itself was breathing, expanding and contracting in time with Orloff's frantic heartbeat. From within those cracks, the shadows began to emerge, thin, serpentine tendrils of darkness that reached out, winding their way toward the prisoners. The shadows moved like liquid, undulating, as though they had a life of their own, One by one, the prisoners stopped moving. Their bodies froze, their faces blank, as though they were no longer aware of their surroundings. And then, in the darkness, something else emerged. Orlov couldn't comprehend it. It was like a figure, but not a figure. It was something shapeless, something that defied all logic, all understanding. A mass of darkness, pulsing and writhing, its form constantly shifting, as though it was both there and not there at the same time. And in that darkness, Orlov saw it. The eyes, hundreds, thousands of them, glowing with an unnatural light, fixed on him, watching him, waiting. Chapter Summary. In Chapter 4, Dr. Orlov is faced with the horrific consequences of his experiment. The prisoners have begun to transform into something unrecognizable, twisted, broken versions of themselves. Their eyes, their behavior, their very beings are no longer human. The gas has not only deprived them of sleep, but it has allowed something other, something malevolent, to seep into their minds. As Orlov watches the prisoners descend into madness, he realizes too late that the darkness inside the chamber has come alive. The experiment has opened a door that cannot be closed, and Orlov finds himself caught in the grip of the horrors he has unleashed. The line between science and madness has blurred, and now the shadows in the walls are no longer just figments of the mind. They are real. Chapter 5. The Descent. The control room was silent, save for the rhythmic tapping of Orlov's pen against the desk. His hand trembled as he wrote, though he tried to steady it. His thoughts were fragmented, and no matter how hard he tried to focus, the image of the prisoners in the chamber, their distorted faces, their hollow eyes, kept pulling his mind back. The horrors he had witnessed over the last several hours had left him in a state of numb disbelief. He had conducted hundreds of experiments in his career, but this one was different. The prisoners' faces, the hollowed eyes, and the shadows that seemed to crawl from the very walls of the chamber. It was as though reality itself had bent, contorted, into something unrecognizable. There was something malevolent in that room, something dark, alive, something that had been awakened by the gas, by his actions, the whispers, the shadows, the eyes watching him. Orlov shook his head, trying to clear it. He couldn't afford to let himself get caught up in the same madness that had overtaken his subjects. He was a scientist, a professional. The data was what mattered, the results. He needed to see it through, but even as he thought that, he couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that he was already too deep into this, too far gone to pull back now. With the faintest stir, the chamber was silent now, eerily so. The low hum of the equipment outside the room barely registered in Orlov's ears as he turned to the monitor. The prisoners, who had been writhing in pain just hours before, were still now. Their bodies stiff, but their faces were wrong, eyes wide, but unseeing. Their mouths hanging open in grotesque shapes, as if some otherworldly force had distorted them, pulling their expressions into strange, unnatural positions. The gas had kept them awake far longer than they should have been able to endure, but it wasn't just the sleep deprivation that had caused this. No, there was something else in the room now. Something had crossed over with the absence of sleep. Something had entered them. Orlov studied the monitor with growing dread. The prisoners' breathing was shallow, ragged, but they hadn't moved in hours. There were no signs of distress, no jerky spasms or convulsions. Nothing like what he had seen earlier. The stillness itself was suffocating. And then a flicker, a movement from the corner of the room. Orlov's breath caught. At first he thought his eyes were deceiving him. But no, it was real. One of the prisoners, prisoner number 3, the one who had been the most fractured, the most affected, was standing. His body was no longer in the twisted, hunched position it had been in for hours. He was upright, his back straight, his feet planted firmly on the ground, though his body appeared unnaturally rigid. His head was tilted to one side, as though his neck could no longer support the weight of his skull. His eyes remained fixed on the corner of the room, staring into the darkness, as if something unseen was there. Orlov's stomach churned. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The man's eyes, they were no longer human. They were black, empty voids, staring into the space beyond. His mouth was open in an unnatural grimace, but no sound escaped. just silence. The other prisoners had begun to shift in their seats as well, their eyes following the figure as it moved. But there was no sound, no words. They simply watched him. And then, as if on cue, all 4 prisoners began to chant. The words were low at first, murmuring, almost inaudible. Their mouths moved, but their voices were distorted, garbled as if coming from somewhere deep within their throats. It was a single word, repeated over and over again. Hungry, hungry, hungry. The sound was sickening, an eerie, rasping chant that echoed through the chamber, reverberating in the walls of Orlov's mind. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the words twisted and spiraled, morphing into something otherworldly. He tried to make sense of it. What were they saying? But it didn't matter. It was too late. Orlov could feel the oppressive weight of something else, something outside the experiment, something inside the chamber pressing in on him. He was no longer in control. He hadn't been for hours, perhaps even longer. A new presence. The room began to grow colder. The temperature in the control room dropped noticeably, and Orlov's breath came in short, panicked bursts. The air in the chamber felt thick, suffocating, as though the darkness itself was closing in on the prisoners. The shadows in the corners of the room, the ones that Orlov had tried to ignore, had grown longer, thicker, as if they were reaching out for the prisoners. They seemed to be alive, writhing, twisting in ways that were not possible. The shadows in the corner began to pulse like the beat of a heart. They moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, and then, suddenly, the room grew even darker. The lights flickered and died. For a moment, Orlov stood still, frozen in disbelief. His eyes widened as the monitor in front of him blinked out, and the room was plunged into absolute darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the control panels, dim, insufficient to see anything clearly. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the darkness, Orlov could hear them. He could hear the prisoners now. Not their voices, but something else. Something closer. He felt it. The pressure. Something was moving in the chamber. Something was closing in. The gas, the lack of sleep, and the toll it had taken on the prisoners had unlocked something. Something ancient, something alive, something waiting. The air was thick with it. A heaviness, an oppressive force, like the very walls were closing in. The shadows were stretching, growing longer and darker. Orlov's heart raced as he turned to the technician beside him, but the technician was frozen in place, his face pale, his mouth open in silent terror. And then, from the chamber, came a voice. "Stop it. Please, stop it." It was faint at first, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere, from nowhere at once. But it was unmistakable. It was the voice of a prisoner, though Orlov couldn't tell which one. "You can't leave. We won't let you leave." Orlov staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. The words didn't make sense. The prisoners, they were supposed to be broken. But this voice, it wasn't broken. It was full of malice. It was full of hunger. The lights flickered again, and the temperature in the room plunged even further. Orlov's breath came in sharp, panicked bursts as he fumbled with the buttons in front of him, trying to regain control, trying to stop it all, but it was already too late. The shadows were no longer just shapes. They were reaching. They were climbing up the walls, slithering across the ceiling, crawling over the prisoners. They were pulling them into the darkness. The prisoners were no longer sitting still. They were moving, crawling, shifting, their bodies twisting and contorting as if they were being pulled by unseen hands. Their faces were twisted in grotesque expressions of pain and ecstasy. They were not screaming. They were laughing, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down Orlov's spine. The lights died completely. The monitor went dark, and all Orlov could hear now was the sound of their breathing. Ragged, shallow, frantic, and then came the whispers. "Hungry, so hungry." Orlov's blood ran cold. The scream. And then it happened. A scream tore through the chamber. It wasn't just any scream. It was inhuman. A sound that came from deep within the soul, a tortured, guttural cry that seemed to reverberate through the walls. It was the scream of a man who had been broken. Orlov felt his chest tighten. The scream was raw, primal, but it didn't belong to the man he thought it did. Prisoner number 1 had stopped speaking. His body had stopped moving. It wasn't him. And yet, Orloff knew with a terrible clarity that it was one of them. One of the prisoners had crossed over into something else. He turned to the control panel, his mind racing, trying to formulate a plan, trying to regain control, but the chamber was completely silent now. And then, nothing. The darkness pressed in. Orloff reached toward the emergency shutdown button. But before he could touch it, the walls of the chamber began to groan, low and guttural, as though something ancient was awakening from the depths of the earth. And then came the voice. "You opened the door, and now you'll see." The voice was everywhere. It came from within the chamber, from behind Orloff, from inside his own mind. Orloff's eyes widened in terror. And then, just as quickly, everything went dark. Chapter Summary. In Chapter 5, Dr. Orloff's once-controlled experiment spirals into complete chaos as the prisoners begin to lose their humanity. The gas, combined with the psychological strain, unleashes a malevolent force within the chamber that begins to consume both the prisoners and Orloff's mind. The prisoners are no longer just suffering from sleep deprivation. They have become something else, empty vessels inhabited by a darkness beyond human comprehension. Orloff struggles to regain control, but it's too late. The shadows, the whispers, and the unearthly presence that has crossed over from the darkness pull the experiment beyond the point of no return. The line between science and horror has been crossed, and Orloff finds himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Chapter 6. The Final Descent. The lights in the control room flickered again, casting fleeting shadows across Orloff's face. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but it only deepened. His hands were shaking, beads of cold sweat forming on his forehead, as the room around him seemed to grow colder, more oppressive. The air had grown thick, heavy with something that wasn't just the atmosphere. It was something else, something watching him, something alive. For a brief moment, Orloff thought he had imagined the voice, that whisper. "You opened the door. Now you'll see." He had been hearing things ever since the prisoners had begun to slip into whatever nightmare had taken hold of them. The walls were whispering, the air pressing in with an unnatural force, and his thoughts were beginning to blur. But this time he couldn't shake it. The feeling that there was something more in that room, something beyond the prisoners, beyond the shadows, something ancient, something hungry. And now the chamber was silent. Too silent. It had been hours since the last screams, the last desperate pleas. The only sound now was the faint hum of the machinery and the rhythmic beeping of the monitors, their steady pulse almost mocking in its normalcy. Orloff had no idea how long he had been standing here, frozen in place, eyes glued to the monitors, waiting for something, anything to change. His hand trembled as he reached for the control panel, his fingers brushing over the cold surface. He needed to do something. He needed to end it. But something kept him from pulling the emergency shutdown lever, something primal, a force he couldn't explain. It was too late for the experiment to end now. He closed his eyes for a moment, his mind clouded with an image he couldn't shake. The faces of the prisoners, contorted in madness, their eyes empty and black, their bodies twisted in grotesque shapes. They had become something more than human. They were no longer just subjects. They were vessels. Vessels for something ancient and incomprehensible that had been awakened by their suffering. The gas had done more than keep them awake. It had ripped open the fabric of their minds, allowing whatever was waiting to slip in. Orloff's breath caught in his throat as he remembered the figure, the shadow that had moved through the chamber, the one that had reached out to the prisoners, the one that had locked its eyes on him. He had seen it. He had felt it, and it had seen him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as his mind flashed back to the moment when the lights had gone out, when the prisoner had spoken, when the walls had groaned as though something was stirring inside them. Something was inside. He wasn't sure what was real anymore, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the very walls of the facility were alive, breathing with an ancient hunger that had been unleashed the moment the experiment had begun. The Chamber of Shadows. Inside the chamber, the prisoners were still. Too still. Prisoner number 1, the first to crack under the pressure of the gas, was slumped in his chair, his body twisted at unnatural angles. His head was tilted backward, mouth agape in a silent scream, but there was no sound. His eyes, once dark and full of life, were now empty pits, black, lifeless, like the hollows of a corpse. His body had begun to decompose, the skin starting to peel away in patches, revealing the raw, oozing flesh beneath. The stench of decay hung in the air, thick and sickening. Prisoner number 2, the most silent and detached, had become something even worse. He had stopped breathing. His body slumped forward in his chair, his skin pale. But his eyes, they were wide open, staring blankly ahead. But it wasn't just that they were open. It was that they were no longer human. They were like black holes, absorbing the light around them. He wasn't just dead. He was something else. Something beyond death. Something trapped between this world and the next. The other prisoners had begun to show the same symptoms. They were no longer reacting to their environment. Their eyes, their bodies. They were no longer alive, not in any way that Orlov understood. They were shells, hollowed out, consumed by whatever had entered them. But still, they watched. Even as they moved, even as their bodies spasmed and twitched unnaturally, their eyes followed Orlov's every move. It was as if they could see him, and yet they didn't. The shadow had taken root. Orlov's stomach churned as he turned back to the monitors. He had seen the horror before, the slow degradation of the human mind and body. But this wasn't just physical decay. This wasn't just madness. This was something far older, something more primal. The prisoners had become vessels for something inhuman, something ancient and hungry. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were alive, and they were taking them. Batifati Rubaf, a voice in the dark. Orlov turned toward the glass, pressing his palm against it, his mind reeling. He couldn't look away. He couldn't tear his eyes from the nightmare unfolding before him. And then, in the deepest silence, he heard it. A voice, low and guttural, like the growl of an animal. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, inside the chamber, inside his mind, but it was clear, unmistakable. You cannot stop it. Orlov's breath hitched in his chest. His heart thudded in his ears. He turned to the technician standing beside him, but the man was paralyzed with fear, his wide eyes locked onto the monitors, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Orlov whispered, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The technician didn't respond. He didn't need to. The voice spoke again, louder this time, as if mocking Orlov's fear. "You opened the door. Now you will stay with us." Orlov's mind reeled. The door. What door? Had the gas opened some kind of gateway? Had it allowed something to cross over? The prisoner's words, the shadow's presence. It was all connected, but he couldn't comprehend it. It wasn't just sleep deprivation. It was something worse. This wasn't just an experiment. It was a ritual. The darkness in the chamber began to writhe, like an invisible hand reaching for the prisoners, for the walls, for the very air around them. The shadows stretched out across the chamber, expanding outward like dark tendrils, wrapping themselves around the prisoners. Orlov could hear them, the whispers, the low chants, the words they spoke in unison. Hungry, hungry, hungry. It wasn't the prisoners speaking anymore. It was the shadows. It was the thing inside them. Orlov stumbled back from the glass, his chest tight with panic. His mind was no longer functioning clearly. The boundaries of reality had begun to warp. The walls, no, the entire room, was shifting, twisting. He could see the faint outline of the shadows creeping up the walls, crawling down from the ceiling. They were moving, twisting, and in their wake, the prisoners began to writhe again. But this time it was different. This time, the prisoners weren't just reacting to the shadows, they were calling to them. Their mouths moved in unison, their bodies convulsing as if they were being pulled from within. The shadows swirled around them like a cloak, their bodies sucked into the dark mass, their limbs stretching, twisting, contorting. And then, they stopped. All at once, they froze. Orlov's heart stopped as he watched in horror. The prisoners, no, the shadows, were looking at him now. Their hollow eyes, empty and black, locked onto him through the glass. And then came the voice, "You will join us." The reaching darkness. Orlov couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, the terror wrapping around him like a vice. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't obey. The chamber seemed to breathe around him, the darkness inside it pressing in on him, suffocating him, as if the very air was alive. The whispers grew louder. The shadows were no longer just confined to the chamber. They were everywhere. They were in the walls, in the air, in his mind. The boundaries of the room had blurred. The walls had become one with the darkness. The floor, the ceiling, the glass, everything was bending, warping, as though the very fabric of reality was being pulled apart. The prisoners, those poor souls who had once been men, were now nothing but vessels. Their bodies had been completely overtaken by the shadows, their limbs stretching and twisting beyond recognition. But it wasn't just their bodies, it was their souls. They had been consumed. The darkness had taken hold of them, and now it was reaching for Orlov. He could feel it. It was inside him too. His skin crawled as the air thickened around him, pressing in like a tangible force. He gasped, trying to breathe, but the air felt thick, suffocating, as though something was choking him from the inside out. His vision began to blur as he struggled to hold on to his thoughts. The world around him was bending, shifting, warping. And then he saw it. The shadow. It was behind him now. It was everywhere. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't even move. The darkness had taken him, and the last thing he heard was the echoing, guttural voice that had followed him through the experiment. "You will never leave." Chapter summary. In Chapter 6, Dr. Orlov's descent into terror continues as the experiment spirals into the unimaginable. The prisoners, having succumbed to the effects of the sleep deprivation, are now vessels for an ancient, malevolent force. The gas has opened a gateway to something beyond comprehension, something alive that has taken hold of the prisoners and is now reaching for Orlov himself. The boundaries between reality and nightmare blur as the shadows move within the chamber, consuming the prisoners and drawing Orlov into their terrifying grip. As the darkness closes in, Orlov is left to confront the horrifying truth that there is no escape from the horrors he has unleashed. Chapter 7. The Unseen. Hunger. Dr. Orlov stood frozen, his hand hovering over the control panel, his fingers trembling. He could feel his heart pounding, the beat of it reverberating through his body like a drum in the night. The room around him was thick with an unnatural stillness, but there was something else, something wrong. The silence was no longer comforting. It was suffocating, as if the very air in the control room had thickened into a fog that pressed down on him. His eyes darted between the monitors, his breath quickening with every passing second. The prisoners, once writhing in pain and desperation, were now eerily still. It had been hours since the last scream, the last tortured cry for mercy, and yet Orlov felt something in the pit of his stomach, something cold, something that gnawed at him, telling him this silence wasn't peace. It was a lull before the storm. For the first time since the experiment had begun, Orlov questioned what he had done. He had been so focused on the data, on the experiment's success. The results were unprecedented. The gas had worked. The prisoners hadn't slept. But at what cost? What had they become? What had he unleashed? His thoughts were interrupted by a low, throbbing hum. At first it was subtle, a vibration in the walls, the floor beneath his feet. But as Orlov's gaze moved to the observation window, his stomach twisted with a sense of dread that gnawed at his bones. The shadows in the chamber, once faint and barely noticeable, had begun to shift. They were no longer shadows, but thick, creeping darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His fingers clenched the edge of the control panel as his gaze locked on the monitors. Prisoner number 1, who had been the most vocal, the most desperate, was still in his chair. But there was something wrong, something deeply wrong. His body was motionless, but his head was tilted back at an unnatural angle. The skin stretched tight over his skull. His eyes, once dark and full of life, were now black voids. Empty, hollow. They stared directly at the observation window, but Orlov couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't looking at him. They were looking through him, as if whatever had taken hold of the prisoner was no longer interested in anything human. Prisoner number 2 was similarly frozen, his body slumped over in his chair, arms dangling limply at his sides. His eyes were wide open, bloodshot, but they too had taken on that unnatural, unblinking stare. It was as if they were staring into the abyss, into something far beyond the scope of the human mind. And then, as if on cue, they spoke. The sound was barely audible at first, a low rasping that filled the chamber. The words were indistinct, whispered, like they were coming from deep within their throats, struggling to find the air to form them. "Stop! Please! Stop!" The voice came from prisoner number 1, but it didn't sound like him. It wasn't his voice anymore. It was distorted, like something was trying to force its way through, a thing that had burrowed its way into his body and was now speaking with his mouth. Orloff's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat. What was happening? This wasn't just sleep deprivation. This wasn't just madness. This was something else, something impossible. The sound shifted, grew clearer. "It's here. It's inside me." The words hit Orloff like a physical blow. His body felt numb, as if he were sinking deeper into a nightmare, unable to wake. The gas had done more than just keep the prisoners awake. It had opened a door to something dark, something malevolent, something that should not have been allowed to exist in this world. The shadows in the room seemed to move, to crawl across the walls, reaching toward the prisoners. Orloff's eyes widened as the walls themselves seemed to bend and twist, as though they were made of something other than stone and concrete. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were alive, moving, and they were hungry. Prisoner number 1 began to twitch, his body spasming violently as though something was fighting to escape from within him. His mouth opened wide, wider than it should have, as though his jaw had unhinged. A deep, guttural scream broke from his throat, but it wasn't a scream of human pain. It was something else, something unnatural. "You've done this," the voice rasped from prisoner number 1's mouth. "You opened the door, and now we are free." Orloff's breath came in short, panicked bursts. He wanted to turn away, but he couldn't. His body was rooted to the spot, his eyes glued to the screen. The prisoners weren't moving anymore. They weren't screaming. They were changing. Their bodies were contorting in ways that defied logic, their faces twisting in grotesque, unnatural shapes. The shadows were pulling them, consuming them, wrapping around their bodies like a suffocating blanket. And then the whispers came again. Only this time, it wasn't just the prisoners. It was the shadows. "Join us! Join us! Join us!" The words flowed from every corner of the chamber, a chorus of voices, deep and guttural, like something ancient had begun to speak. The air thickened, growing heavy with the weight of something far beyond comprehension. The shadows slithered across the floor, creeping toward the prisoners, toward the walls, toward the very heart of the chamber. Orloff's heart pounded, his vision swimming. His thoughts were muddled, disconnected. He wanted to run, wanted to scream, but his body refused to obey. He was paralyzed, trapped in the horror that was unfolding before him. And then, one of the prisoners, prisoner number 2, moved. His body jerked violently, his arms flailing as though he were fighting some invisible force. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes were fixed on the wall in front of him, but they were no longer his eyes. They were empty, black holes that seemed to suck in the very light around them. His body twisted and contorted, his legs snapping backward at a grotesque angle, as if his bones were being ripped from his body. But he felt no pain. There was no scream, no cry for mercy. Orloff's stomach twisted as he watched, horrified and helpless. The prisoner wasn't just moving, he was changing. His body was becoming something else, something far worse than anything Orloff had ever seen. "It's too late. Too late." Prisoner number 2's voice broke through the chaos, but it was not his voice. It was something deeper, something far more ancient, a voice that came from somewhere else. "We are inside you now. You opened the door." The walls of the chamber groaned in response. Orloff felt the vibration beneath his feet, the very foundation of the building seeming to tremble with the weight of something alive moving within it. The shadows were growing, expanding, filling the room until there was no longer any distinction between the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was all one dark, pulsing mass, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly, pulling everything into itself. Orlov couldn't breathe. The air was thick, oppressive, and the darkness had consumed him. It was inside him now. He could feel it crawling through his veins, filling his lungs with something that was not air, but something else. Something dark, something ancient. And then he heard the scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was a roar, a terrifying, inhuman sound that tore through the chamber like a thunderclap, shaking the walls, rattling the very air. It came from the shadows, from the thing that had taken hold of the prisoners. It was a sound of hunger, of insatiable need. Orlov's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, his mind spiraling into madness. The shadows, the prisoners, the darkness, they were all one. They had merged. They had become. He couldn't escape. The door was locked. The windows were sealed. The chamber was closing in on him, the shadows pressing in on all sides. The whispers were everywhere, in his ears, in his mind, in his very soul. "Join us! You cannot escape!" the voices whispered, now all around him. "You opened the door, and now you are one of us," Orlov screamed. But no sound came. Chapter Summary. In Chapter 7, Dr. Orlov is forced to confront the horrific consequences of his actions as the prisoners, consumed by the malevolent force within the chamber, undergo an unfathomable transformation. The darkness has become sentient, and the prisoners are no longer human. They are vessels for an ancient evil that has crossed over into their reality. Orlov's desperate attempts to regain control fail, and he finds himself trapped in a nightmarish world where the line between the living and the dead is obliterated. The darkness closes in, and Orlov realizes too late that there is no escape from the horrors he has unleashed. The door has been opened, and the shadows have claimed him. Chapter 8. The Wailing Dark. Dr. Orlov's mind was unraveling faster than he could comprehend. The chamber had become something else, something beyond human understanding. The shadows that had once been fleeting and vague had taken on substance, growing and shifting like living creatures. The gas, the experiment, the prisoners, they were no longer the issue. The true horror was what had been awakened. Orlov's heart raced in his chest, his pulse pounding in his ears. But it wasn't just fear. It was something worse, something primal. He could feel it in the air now. It wasn't just the gas that had affected the prisoners. It was the darkness inside them. The thing they had unwittingly unleashed had taken root in their very souls, twisting their bodies, their minds, into something alien, something wrong. The shadows had reached out, enveloping the room, suffocating everything with their suffocating weight. The air had become thick, heavy with an unnatural, almost alive presence. The walls of the chamber no longer looked like walls. They were breathing, pulsing like the ribs of some monstrous beast. The chamber itself was becoming the thing that haunted it. The darkness creeping out from within the stone, clawing at the very foundation of reality. And yet, Orlov was still here, still standing. Why? He had watched the prisoners break, seen them transform into vessels for the thing that had taken over. But now, he could barely remember what had happened. Time had lost its meaning. He could no longer tell if hours had passed or days. The room was a blur of shadows. The low, guttural sounds of the prisoners, no, the things, filling the space around him. The lights flickered. The control panels buzzed erratically. But the noise from the chamber, the sound of whispers, the rustling of shifting bodies, never ceased. There was a rhythm to it, like a heartbeat, like something waking from a long, torturous slumber. And then, a sound pierced through the whispers. A cry, a scream. It wasn't the scream of a man. It wasn't the scream of a prisoner or anything human. This scream was deep, resonating in Orlov's very core. It came from the shadows themselves, from the thing that had overtaken the prisoners. The sound was deafening, filling every corner of the room with its anguish, its hunger, its insatiable need. Orlov's mind reeled. He couldn't think, couldn't focus. The air around him felt like it was vibrating, humming with dark energy. He could feel the walls closing in, the shadows curling around him like hands, gripping him, pulling him toward the center of the chamber. The thing was coming closer. It was here, and it had no intention of leaving. He staggered back, his legs weak beneath him. His breath came in shallow gasps as the world around him warped, twisted, bent. The shadows seemed to bend reality itself, pulling everything into their fold. The once sterile, lifeless control room had become part of it. Orloff was no longer standing in a room filled with machines and monitors. He was in the heart of something ancient, something alive. The Eye's prisoner. Number One's body twitched again. His eyes, those hollow black voids, finally moved. Orloff had watched for hours, perhaps longer, as the prisoner had remained motionless, a twisted, disfigured mockery of a human being. His body had been torn apart, his skin shredded like paper, but it was the eyes that Orloff couldn't forget. The eyes that now watched him, not just stared at him, but locked onto him. Orloff felt his breath catch in his throat. Those eyes were looking through him. There was no recognition, no sign of humanity left in them. They weren't just looking, they were seeing him, all of him. And the worst part, the most terrifying part, was that Orloff knew that they were aware of him. They were watching, waiting, knowing. And then the voice came. It was not the voice of prisoner number one, nor any of the prisoners. It was deeper, darker, older. It was a voice from beneath, from beyond, a voice that had never been human. The words reverberated in the air, distorting the space around Orloff like a physical blow. You should have never come here. The voice was chilling. It wasn't a threat. It was an inevitability. Orloff had opened the door, allowed something ancient to enter, and now it was here. The prisoners, no, the vessels, began to move. Slowly at first, their bodies jerking as though they were puppets with their strings cut. Their heads snapped to face Orloff in unison, their eyes locking onto him with a terrible, unnatural precision. They weren't just staring, they were waiting for him to realize the truth of what had happened. Orloff's mind spun. His breath became shallow as his knees buckled beneath him. He couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to grow closer, the air thickening, suffocating him. He reached for the nearest chair, trying to steady himself, but his hands slipped through the dark shadows that now filled the room. The shadows had grown, manifested, until they were no longer just moving through the walls. They were all around him, in him. Prisoner number two, his face a mask of blood and flesh, opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. The darkness within him had taken over. Orloff could hear it in the man's silence, a deep guttural growl that emanated from the very core of his being. And then, the whispers, soft at first but then louder, faster, crawling over Orloff's skin like insects. Join us. Join us. The voice was now coming from everywhere. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the very air around him. The shadows weren't just shadows. They weren't just moving. They were speaking. They were alive. Orloff stumbled back, his hands grasping at the cold, damp walls of the control room. The darkness pressed in on him, thicker now, like smoke suffocating his lungs. The whispers were louder, more insistent. Join us. You opened the door. You can never leave. The prisoners, once human, had become part of it. They were no longer themselves. They were vessels. And now, Orloff was part of them too. The line between him and them had been erased. He could feel it. The shadows were inside him, crawling under his skin, filling his lungs, consuming him. The reckoning Orloff's vision blurred. His body shook with an uncontrollable terror as the walls of the room seemed to dissolve. He no longer knew where he was. The room had vanished. There was only the darkness now, the shadows, the voices. You cannot escape, the voice whispered in his ear, and it sounded as if it came from within his own mind. You opened the door, and now we are inside. His body jerked forward, as though some invisible force had grabbed him, yanked him toward the center of the chamber. The walls, the shadows, they were all closing in. He could see the figures of the prisoners, the vessels, twisting and writhing in agony. But they weren't suffering. They were alive, aware, and they were waiting. And then they spoke again. But this time, their voices were unified, a chorus of distorted, unholy sounds that filled the air with a suffocating weight. "Join us!" Orlov's chest tightened, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The darkness was suffocating him. It was everywhere. It was inside him. He could feel it crawling into his mind, twisting his thoughts, making him see things he didn't want to see. The shadows reached out, their tendrils curling around his body, pulling him toward the center of the room. Orlov struggled, but it was no use. His legs gave out beneath him, and he fell to the ground, his arms flailing. But it was as though the shadows were holding him in place. And then, from the very depths of the darkness, the thing spoke. "You are one of us now." The world went black. Chapter summary. In Chapter 8, the horrors that Dr. Orlov has unleashed continue to escalate. The prisoners, consumed by the malevolent force within the chamber, have fully transformed into vessels for something ancient, something hungry. The boundaries between reality and nightmare have completely dissolved, and the darkness surrounding Orlov becomes all-consuming. The shadows are no longer just in the room. They are part of him, pulling him into their grip, and there is no escape. The chapter ends with Orlov being pulled into the darkness, as the line between him and the prisoners disappears. The experiment has gone far beyond what was ever intended, and now Orlov is trapped within the same nightmare he created. Chapter 9. The Hollow Echoes. Doctor Orlov couldn't remember how much time had passed. His mind had fractured under the weight of the horror around him. The shadows in the chamber, the ones that had once seemed like distant, fading whispers, had become real, tangible, suffocating, alive in a way that defied everything Orlov had ever understood. His thoughts, his very perception of reality, had begun to blur. Every second felt like an eternity, and yet nothing made sense anymore. His body was numb. He could feel the cold, damp air pressing in from all sides, thick and suffocating, like the breath of something ancient, something that had waited for millennia to be freed. The walls of the room had collapsed, transformed into a living, breathing entity. The floor beneath his feet seemed to shift, as though it too was a part of the dark mass that was growing, ever expanding. He tried to focus on his surroundings. He needed to think. He needed to act. But his thoughts were tangled, confused, lost in a haze of dread. The room no longer looked like a place of science, of observation. It had become something else, something unrecognizable, an abomination born from the darkness he had dared to awaken. There was no longer any distinction between the control room, the chamber, and the thing inside them all. The prisoners, the vessels, were still there, but they were not the same. Their bodies, once human, had twisted beyond recognition. They had become puppets to the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were being manipulated by unseen hands. Their mouths moved, but the sounds they emitted were not human. Their voices were distorted, guttural, and inhuman, like something that had crawled out of a nightmare. Orlov stumbled backward, his vision spinning. The very air around him seemed to hum with dark energy. The whispers, their voices were growing louder, clearer, resonating in his head like a physical presence. They weren't just in the room anymore. They were inside him. The shadows were inside him. The prison had no walls anymore. There was no escape. "Join us!" The words echoed in his skull, a constant pulsing rhythm that filled his every thought, his every breath. "You are already ours." Orlov's breath caught in his throat as his knees buckled beneath him. The floor shifted, and he fell to his hands, the coldness seeping through his skin. He could feel the darkness crawling up his arms, pulling at his veins, filling his bloodstream with an icy chill. He gasped for air, but it was thick, heavy. Every breath felt like it was being dragged from him. He looked up, his heart pounding in his chest as the prisoners, no longer human, slowly turned toward him. Their eyes, those black, empty voids, locked onto him. Their expressions were blank, but there was something behind those eyes, something that was watching, waiting. "You opened the door," prisoner number 1 rasped, his voice deep and foreign, his lips curled into a grotesque smile, his mouth too wide, too unnatural. "Now, you are part of us." Orlov's vision blurred as the words echoed in his mind. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. He was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake, unable to escape. The darkness was everywhere now. It had taken over. The walls, the floor, the very air itself had been consumed. It was all one, and he was part of it. The chamber around him seemed to pulse. It was no longer a place, but a living entity. A dark, insatiable beast that fed on fear, on pain, on the life force of anyone foolish enough to enter. And Orlov had opened the door. The shadows around him seemed to writhe, like serpents crawling over each other, reaching for him. He tried to move, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as if the darkness had already claimed him, already filled his mind, his body, his soul, and then a sound, a crack. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, splitting the air like the sound of bone breaking, of something being torn apart. Orlov looked up in terror as the shadows seemed to tear open, as though something were breaking free from within them. Something was breaking free. The thing. The shadows twisted and writhed, becoming more than just darkness. Something else was forming inside them. Orlov's heart raced as he saw it. A shape, shifting in the blackness, its form impossible to define. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he could comprehend. It was a mass, a swirling vortex of darkness, tendrils reaching out, growing, stretching. It had no face, no features. It was pure presence, a force that existed beyond the physical world, beyond the fabric of reality itself. But Orlov could feel it. He could feel its hunger, its desire to consume. It wasn't just the prisoners. It wanted him. It needed him. And then, the voices. Hundreds of voices. Thousands. All speaking at once. Each one a distorted, guttural sound, layered on top of each other in a horrible cacophony. You will become one of us. Orlov's chest tightened, his throat closing as he struggled to breathe. The thing was pulling at him, pulling him into it. He could feel its tendrils wrapping around his body, inside him, crawling through his skin, his veins, his bones. It was taking him piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He screamed, but no sound came. The darkness filled his ears. The shadows surrounded him, suffocating him. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the room, once familiar, was now gone. There was no space left, no air, no light. There was only the thing, the darkness, the hunger, the voices. Orlov felt his body tremble as the darkness began to take shape. It was in him. He could feel it crawling inside his chest, sinking into his lungs, taking root in his mind. He knew now what the prisoners had become. They were no longer themselves. They were vessels for the thing, the shadow, the hunger that had entered their souls. And now, Orlov would be the same. The choice. The shadows grew thicker, the darkness now an oppressive weight pressing down on him from all sides. He could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thinner. It was as though he were being buried alive, suffocated by the very thing he had unleashed. He could see the prisoners, the vessels, standing around him now, their eyes fixed on him with that same hollow, dead stare. Their bodies were contorted, but their mouths were moving, speaking in unison, chanting words Orlov couldn't understand. The darkness was pulling him into them, into it. There was no escape. There was no way out. It had consumed them, and now it was consuming him. The voice that had come from the shadows spoke again, this time louder, more insistent. "You opened the door. You cannot escape now. You belong to us." Orlov's mind screamed, but it was a hollow sound. His body fought to move, to run, but there was no place to go. The room was gone. There was no outside. There was only the dark, the hunger, and the thing that had claimed them all. In that moment, Orlov understood. The experiment was never about the prisoners. It was never about science. It was about the door to the other side. The door he had opened, willingly or not, and the thing that had been waiting on the other side. It wasn't just an experiment. It was a ritual, and now he was the final piece. The transformation, the thing within the shadows moved closer. Orlov felt the tendrils slide over his skin like cold, oily hands. pulling him deeper into the darkness. His body froze as he felt something inside him snap, like a string being cut, and suddenly, he was no longer himself. He felt his body stretching, twisting, the very fabric of his being ripped apart and remade. His mind screamed, but there was no sound. He could feel the shadows inside him, filling him, merging with him until he was no longer human. He was no longer Orloff. He was one of them. The transformation wasn't painful. It wasn't agony. It was empty. There was nothing but a hollow void filling him, erasing everything he had been. His thoughts, his memories, his identity. They were all slipping away, consumed by the thing inside him. The darkness had taken him, and in that moment, Orloff realized with a sickening clarity that he had been a fool to think he could control it. The thing wasn't just in the room, it was inside him, and now there was no escaping. The shadows swirled around him, filling his mind with the whispers of 1,000 voices. They were calling to him, calling him home. He was one of them now. He was part of the darkness. Chapter Summary. In Chapter 9, Dr. Orloff's final descent into madness and horror is complete, as the darkness within the chamber consumes him. The prisoners, now mere vessels for the malevolent force, have transcended humanity, becoming conduits for an ancient evil. Orloff is drawn into the same fate as the prisoners, transformed into one of the shadows, one of the hollow vessels. The experiment, which began as a scientific pursuit, has turned into an unholy ritual, and Orloff realizes too late that the darkness he unleashed has claimed him. There is no escape, no turning back. The shadows have won. The door has been opened, and Orloff is now part of the thing that has crossed over. Chapter 10. The door remains open. Dr. Orloff's final scream had been swallowed by the darkness. The room, once sterile and controlled, had long since ceased to exist. There was no longer any distinction between the chamber and the thing within it. Orloff's last fragmented thoughts were now lost within the void. His identity, his very essence, had been erased by the unholy force he had unwittingly set free. He had opened the door, and now the door would never close. The darkness was no longer a concept. It was alive, breathing, pulsing within the walls, beneath the floor, inside the air itself. It was in Orloff, in the prisoners, no, the vessels, in everything. The shadows had consumed them all, and now they were part of it. Orloff no longer existed. He had become one of them. The eyes of the hollow ones. For hours, days perhaps, Orloff had lost all sense of time. His consciousness was no longer his own. He was adrift in a sea of whispers, drowning in a cacophony of voices that echoed from every corner of his mind. They were not his thoughts. They were the thoughts of the thing inside him, the thing inside them. The vessel he had become was filled with darkness, filled with hunger. The chamber no longer resembled anything human. The walls had become alive, moving like skin over bone. They shifted, contorted, breathing in rhythm with the presence inside. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of rot and decay, as though the very life of the building had been drained from it. There was no escape. There never had been. Orloff's mind, now fragmented and lost, could still feel the pull of the shadows, the cold, insistent tug at the very core of his being, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. The thing within him had taken his voice, his soul. All that was left of Orloff now was the hollow echo of a man who had opened the door. And in that silence, the eyes returned. Hundreds of them, thousands. They were everywhere, on the walls, in the dark corners of the chamber, on the prisoners. They were all watching. Empty black eyes. Eyes that had once belonged to the men and women who had suffered at the hands of this experiment, who had been consumed by the very shadows they had helped awaken. But now those eyes were not human. They were empty, hollow, eyes without souls, eyes filled only with the thing that had overtaken them. "We are one," the voices whispered, their words overlapping, distorted, like 1,000 murmurs from beneath the earth. "We are the door, and now you are part of us." Orloff's mind cracked, unable to hold on to the remnants of reality. The walls, the shadows, the voices, they had become one. They were a force, a living, breathing entity that consumed everything in its path. There was no escape from the hunger, from the endless void that stretched beyond the chamber. Orlov had opened the door, and now the door was open forever. The darkness spreads. Outside the chamber, the world had changed. Orlov couldn't see it, but he could feel it. The tremors in the earth, the stillness in the air. The world beyond the experiment was no longer safe. The darkness had already begun to seep out of the chamber, spreading like a plague across the land. It was spreading, infecting everything. It wasn't just the gas, the experiment. It was the door. The thing that had been waiting behind it was now free, and it would not stop until it had consumed all. In the distance, Orlov could hear the faint sound of sirens, the distant screams of those who would never understand what had happened. The shadows were already there, creeping into the world, into the minds of those who were still untouched. It was a slow, insidious thing, but it was already happening. People were starting to change, starting to hear the whispers, starting to see the eyes. And in the control room, where Orlov once stood, a low, rhythmic thudding could be heard. The pulse of the shadows, as though the very ground beneath was breathing, alive with the force that had been released. It was coming closer, pushing against the walls of the chamber, inching toward the door. The door was wide open now. The barrier between worlds had been shattered. There was no going back. Bantamant branch of the endless hunger. In the heart of the chamber, the vessels, the prisoners, stood still, unmoving. Their bodies were no longer recognizable as human. They had been twisted, contorted, their forms stretching and bending into grotesque shapes. Their limbs were no longer where they should be, their heads tilted at impossible angles. Their faces had become masks, masks of horror, masks of pain, but their eyes, those black, empty eyes, the darkness was in them. The shadows had taken root in their minds, in their souls. They were no longer prisoners. They were no longer human. They were part of it now. Part of the thing that had consumed them, that had fed on their fear, their suffering, and now it would feed on Orlov. He could feel it. He could feel the hunger, the insatiable need that lived within the shadows. It was in him now too, as if the very darkness had merged with his soul. He was inside it, and it was inside him. The hunger was endless, consuming, and in that hunger, Orlov could feel the presence of something larger than himself, larger than the prisoners, the thing that had been waiting, that had been locked behind the door. It had never truly been a door at all. It had been a threshold, a crack in the fabric of reality that had been torn open, and now that crack was wide open. The shadows were no longer confined to the chamber. They were spreading, curling outward, reaching into the world. Orlov could feel the pull of it, the way it was infecting everything it touched. The land outside, the people, everything was being pulled into it. It was a slow, methodical spread, but it was unstoppable. The darkness would consume it all. And Orlov, now one of the hollow vessels, could do nothing but watch. The hollow echoes. The voices in Orlov's mind were growing louder. They were no longer distinct. They were no longer the whispers of the prisoners. They were one, a singular dark entity, a collective voice that filled his every thought. "You are one of us now," they whispered. "We have always been here, and now you are part of the darkness." Orlov could feel it, the presence, that ancient malevolent force that had lived for centuries, waiting for this moment. It was here now. It had crossed over. It had won. The shadows in the chamber writhed like a living thing, the darkness consuming everything in its path. The walls, the ceiling, the very air, it was all part of it now. The room had become a part of the thing, and the thing had become part of Orlov. He had opened the door, and now the darkness was everywhere. And then, the eyes. They weren't just in the prisoners anymore. They were everywhere. Orlov could see them, hundreds, thousands, watching him, watching the world. Eyes in the walls, eyes in the shadows, eyes in the very air. They were empty, hollow. They were watching, waiting. Orlov's breath caught in his throat as the reality of what had happened hit him with full force. The door had been opened, but it had never truly been closed. The thing was free now, and there was no way to stop it. There was no escape. He had been a fool to think that he could control it, that he could contain it. He had thought the experiment was about science, but it was never about science. It was always about the thing waiting on the other side of that door. It had crossed over, and now Orlov was part of it. There was no turning back. There was no survival. He had opened the door, and now the door would never close. A chapter summary. In Chapter 10, Dr. Orlov fully realizes the horror he has unleashed as the darkness consumes him and the prisoners. The shadows, once contained within the chamber, have now spread into the world, infecting everything they touch. The line between the living and the dead has blurred, and Orlov, now one of the hollow vessels, becomes part of the malevolent force that has crossed over from another reality. There is no escape from the hunger, from the dark entity that has been freed. The door is wide open, and the world is being swallowed whole. The nightmare that began with a scientific experiment has become an unstoppable, all-consuming force, and Orlov is helpless to stop it. The door will never close again.